On behalf of the Order of Malta, I welcome you to our webinar on global justice and human trafficking towards a new paradigm. We are honored this evening to welcome Professor Thomas Pogge from Yale University and Reverend Jose Nandikara from India, who will discuss poverty and the lack of social and economic development, as well as other root causes of human trafficking based on their experience and research. In his well-known book, Global Justice, Professor Thomas Pogge and his contributors discuss central moral issues arising in the emerging global order, the responsibilities of the strongest societies, moral priorities for the coming decades, and the role of intellectuals in the face of the huge gap between widely expressed moral ambitions and prevailing political and economic realities. In another book, World Poverty and Human Rights, Cosmopolitan Responsibilities and Reforms, Professor Pogge writes, I quote, billions of people are still condemned to a lifetime of severe poverty with all attendant evils of low life expectancy, social exclusion, ill health, illiteracy, dependency, and virtual enslavement. Citizens of the rich countries, however, are conditioned to downplay the severity and persistence of world poverty. If more of us understood the true magnitude of the problem of poverty and our causal involvement in it, might we do what is necessary to eradicate it? End of quote. Let's explore tonight this huge gap between the moral ambitions of the developed world and the prevailing political realities and discuss the basis for a new paradigm. Indeed, human trafficking is growing like cancer in our societies, stronger in poor countries, but also present in the global north, where the gap between wealthy economic leaders and the majority of the population is widening, making it increasingly difficult for families to earn a sufficient income and find decent jobs. The 2024 International Labour Organization report, Profits and Poverty, the Economics of Forced Labour, shows a dramatic increase in traffickers' annual profits since 2014. In 2014, 150 billion US dollars. Today, it estimates traffickers' annual profits at a staggering 236 billion US dollars. These traffickers' annual illegal profits now exceed the annual profits of Walmart, Visa, Amazon, Google, and Apple combined. At least 50 million people worldwide are affected by some form of human trafficking, forced labor, sex trafficking, organ removal, forced pregnancy, and other forms of exploitation. Modern slavery exists everywhere, with more than 1.9 million people working in slave-like conditions in Europe, the US, Japan, and Australia combined. Trafficking, which can be considered a crime against humanity, is the worst form of abuse, but there is a vast gray area of underpaid wages before getting a decent job. Today, we live in a deregulated market where the only thing that matters is the calculation of profit and loss, where people are just numbers to be exploited. If I may quote Pope Francis, such an economy kills, as he said in his apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium in 2013. This is why we will focus on the need to build a new economic and social model that puts the human person at the center, what Pope Francis calls an economy of care versus an economy of waste. And that's a quote from Laudato Si. We now need to reflect on what this economy of care is and how we can achieve it. This webinar aims to encourage public and economic actors to develop what is necessary to protect human life, and dignity. And tonight, as I told you, we are fortunate to have Professor Thomas Pogge, having received his PhD in philosophy from Harvard. Thomas Pogge is Leitner Professor of Philosophy and International Affairs and founding director of the Global Justice Program at Yale, while also holding a part-time position at the University of Central Lancashire. Thomas Pogge is a member of the Norwegian Academy of Science, as well as co-founder of the academics Stand Against Poverty ASAP, an international network aiming to enhance the impact of scholars, teachers, and students on global poverty and of incentives for global health, a team effort towards developing a complement to the pharmaceutical patent regime that would improve access to advanced medicines for the poor worldwide. And now, Thomas Pogge, Professor Pogge, I'm very happy to give you the floor, and please, we are looking forward to listening to you. Thank you.
Very happy to be here, and thank you very much, Michel, for the introduction and even more for organizing this important seminar. I think, as you quoted from my book, I really believe that more people should engage with these issues, and we should really pay a lot more attention to poverty. Let me begin with saying a little bit about human trafficking. I should try to put it this way. Yeah. The expression human trafficking suggests human beings treated as an owned commodity, a commodity that can be controlled and sold and rented for exploitation and abuse, abuse through labor and abuse through sexual services. There are generally three types of enabling conditions, conditions that make human beings vulnerable to being exploited and abused in this way. One is active coercion, where people are, through violence or threats of violence or physical confinement, forced under the control of others. A second condition is situational need, where people are in a very difficult situation, either as a population or as individuals, for example, through natural disaster, civil war, extreme destitution, personal emergencies, and therefore find it rational to subject themselves to the control and abuse of another person. And the third one is psychological vulnerability, where a person is, for example, a child or is drug dependent, emotionally attached or brainwashed into subjecting themselves to the control and domination of another. These three conditions often work together, and one of the conditions may well lead to another. So once you have a person under your control, you can increase their situational needs, you can make them psychologically dependent, and so on. As we said at the beginning, this is akin to slavery. It is continuous with slavery. It is a form of slavery, often also called modern slavery. And it can be either legal or illegal. So I would not confine the term human trafficking and modern slavery to just illegal conditions, but in many countries, and that includes many of the so-called civilized Western countries, there are legal relationships of enslavement that the law does not yet sanction and free people from. So a significant number of people in the United States can be considered slaves, and that is especially true of people who are so-called undocumented aliens and have no rights, are afraid to go to the police to ask for protection because they feel that if they do, they will immediately be deported. What I will focus on today, and that was the task given to me by Michel, is the second of these conditions, situational need, such as destitution, poverty, which then facilitates offers that one cannot refuse, where people offer to help one or to help one's children in exchange for one subjecting oneself to slavery-like conditions. Now, to prepare this, give you a little bit of context, let us start with the American century. The American century, where America means the United States of America, the American century begins essentially in 1941, when the war was clearly on the horizon. This is before Pearl Harbor, but already quite clear that the US would enter the Second World War. And on the eve of the Second World War, or the American entry into it, Roosevelt, the president, formulates the famous four freedoms. His vision and the US vision of a post-war world in which everybody would have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, meaning freedom from need, freedom from poverty, and also freedom from fear. Since 1941, the gross world product of the world has grown 18-fold. So our collective GNP, if you like, is now 18 times larger than it was in 1941. But of course, the world's population has also increased, and so the average income is only 5 times larger than it was in 1941. Still, 5 times, that is a very large increase in the average income of human beings on Earth. And if everybody had participated in this quintupling of the average income, then severe poverty, the kind of poverty that really drives people into trafficking, into forced labor, would be history now, would be gone by now. And some people claim that it is. Bill Gates and Steven Pinker recently had a discussion on YouTube where they showed this diagram. Hunger is essentially non-existing as of 2015. Wish it were so. Unfortunately, it is not so. The poor have been left behind, and very large numbers of people still suffer the kind of extreme poverty that makes modern slavery possible. So this is the income distribution of the world from the website Our World in Data. It is on a logarithmic scale, so equal distances are equal ratios here. And you see the red line, vertical line on the right, showing the global average income, about $62 per person per day. About 6% of the world's population reach that income or higher, and fully 94% of the world's population live below. But what is really dramatic is how far many people live below that average income. So you can see that more than 40% of the world's population do not even have 1/10 of the global average income, which would be $6.17 in purchasing power adjusted currency. So these statistics here are in PPP dollars, also known as international dollars, which reflect the purchasing power of various currencies. Just to give you an idea, if you go to the bank, you can get roughly 80 Indian rupees for a US dollar. But in this conversion, 24 or 25 Indian rupees are deemed sufficient to equal a US dollar because they have as much purchasing power in India as a US dollar has in the United States. So $6.17 is what $6.17 could buy in the United States. That is basically what we are talking about here. And 40%, more than 40% of the world's population live below that. Now, these people who live below that threshold are people who cannot afford a healthy diet. This is from the latest publication of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And you can see here that around 3 billion people cannot afford a healthy diet, more than a third of the human population. And you can also see where these people live. They are concentrated in Africa and in South Asia, but they're also people unable to afford a healthy diet in many other parts, or pretty much all other parts of the world. Now, what exactly do they mean by a healthy diet? You can see here the purchasing power cost of a healthy diet in various countries. It depends how expensive food is in the various countries relative to other things. In the United States of America, you are deemed able to afford a healthy diet if you have $2.63 per person per day in your household. So you need a little more than $10, according to the FAO, for a family of four, a little more than $10 per day. Anybody who lives in the United States or has traveled in the United States knows that this is a very, very stingy measure, and it is a deep challenge indeed to feed a family of four on $10 a day, not just to give them enough calories, but to also give them whatever else is needed for a healthy diet: vitamins, minerals, proteins, macro and micronutrients, and so forth. Now, the US Department of Agriculture is concerned with the same question of a healthy diet. And in order to help people get a healthy diet, it publishes every year a thrifty food plan. That thrifty food plan is supposed to help people feed their family in a healthy way on the lowest possible budget. The USDA, in its most recent report, says that it costs $7.84 per person per day to actually do that. And so its standard is fully 3 times higher than the standard of the FAO. So it's dubious, to put it mildly, that the amount that the FAO deems sufficient for a healthy diet is actually sufficient, at least in the United States. In any case, we can be sure it's an extremely stingy standard. And nevertheless, despite it being so very, very stingy, very large numbers of people, as I showed you, around 3 billion people, or a third of the human population, are unable to afford such a healthy diet. You can see here the countries where that inability is greatest. So in many African countries, such as Madagascar, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and so on, well over 90% of the population cannot afford a healthy diet. And the number of countries here, it's about 50 countries where that percentage is 50% or higher. Now, again, we live in a world of extreme inequality, and you can see it here in a different chart from my friend Branko Milanovic, who shows how this extreme inequality correlates with the core countries, the developed West, the rich countries of Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand, Japan on the one hand, and the so-called periphery countries, the global South on the other hand. And if you take the median income of those two populations, you find that the ratio between those two median incomes is 22.6. So the median person in the developed North is 22.6 times richer in income than the median person in the global South. It is this enormous inequality that we need to overcome if we are ever going to eradicate severe poverty. Now, hunger, what I showed you just now, the inability to afford a healthy diet, that's not the only problem. There are other problems connected with severe deprivation that are also highly relevant to our topic here, the topic of modern slavery. So 2 billion people lack access to essential medicines, 2 billion people lack access to safe drinking water, 1.6 billion people lack adequate shelter, 750 million lack electricity, 3 billion lack adequate sanitation, and now to the last two of these, which are the most relevant, 750 million people are illiterate, and illiteracy, lack of education, of course, greatly increases persons' vulnerability to modern slavery because people don't understand what their rights are. They cannot inform themselves about the circumstances that might constrain them. So, and they have very poor job opportunities. And so they are much more vulnerable to falling into the clutches of modern day enslavers. And the children are relevant, the 217 million children who are officially classified as doing wage work outside of their own household, child laborers. They are relevant in two ways. On the one hand, they are the illiterate people of the future because they are not getting an education. They are instead working under often extremely oppressive conditions, hazardous and demeaning and dirty conditions. And also, they are themselves already in slave-like conditions. So they are doubly relevant as vulnerable people in the future and present day exploited and enslaved people. Now, I leave you with this thought. The global poverty problem is one that people, at least the more rich people in the global north, have only a very, very vague notion of. And in my experience talking to such people, I find that people are greatly underestimating and also overestimating the problem. They are underestimating the magnitude of it. They think that global poverty is a problem of the past. There used to be a lot of poverty, but nowadays really there isn't much of it left, and at least nothing dramatic, nothing really severe or serious. Yeah, people are not quite as well off as we are here in the United States or Europe, but they make a decent living. They're all right. As I showed you, that is far from being the case. The mere fact that we don't encounter such people doesn't mean they don't exist. They do exist, and they exist in the billions. The other thing is that people in the developed North are greatly overestimating what it would cost to overcome this poverty. I showed you how very, very small the incomes of the global poor are relative to the average income. And so it would really only take a few percent, maybe 3 or 4% of the total global income to dramatically improve the situation of all these billions of seriously poor people all over the world. So any thought that we would ruin our own standard of living and become dramatically badly off if we solve the global poverty problem, any such notion is just ill-informed and untrue. So what we should do is we should take the Sustainable Development Goals seriously and really devote to the problem of global poverty the resources and efforts that this problem morally and religiously deserves. And we would thereby take away the conditions that make modern day slavery, human trafficking, possible and make it actually an option that for many people is the only option they have. People have families, they have children to take care of, and they will be willing to sell themselves into abject conditions in order to help their children survive, in order to feed their families, in order to survive themselves. Nobody should be put into that position. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pogge. Thank you very much, Thomas. It's very, very clear. And I like your conclusion. Thomas, would you like to answer this question or to add a few comments?
I would love to do that, yes. And that is indeed the central question that we need to think about. And what I would say is this, that we have a world of very high economic inequality, as I mentioned, and such a world is often self-reinforcing. So you have rich agents, and these rich agents have ways in which they can improve their situation by influencing the rules under which they operate. So we call that in the United States lobbying. And so there is a tremendous amount of lobbying, not just in Washington, D.C., but in Brussels and all the centers of power. And in that lobbying, of course, agents that are already powerful and rich have a great advantage over agents that are poor and marginalized. And they see themselves in competition with each other. So Boeing sees itself in competition with Lockheed and with Airbus. And one AI company or computer company sees itself in competition with another. And so they say that in order to prevail in this competition, we need to pull out all the stops. We have to play hardball. We have to get the Congress on our side. We have to get, parliaments, politicians to support us, to help us, so that we can prevail in this brutal competition against the most powerful companies and billionaires from other countries and maybe from our own country. So in this lobbying activity, they may be focused on other very powerful agents, but of course, it's the poor, the weakest agents, those who have nobody to speak for them, who will fall along the wayside, who will basically be ignored and disregarded as politicians try to serve the powerful interests who are capable of reciprocation, who are able to reward them in return. In the US, this is clearer than anywhere else. We have elections coming up, as you know, Harris versus Trump, and tens of billions of dollars are spent all the time on weekly on trying to influence the elections, and elected officials in the United States need millions and tens of millions of dollars to keep their seat, to be reelected. And where is that money going to come from? All right, it's not going to come from the poor. It's not going to come from trafficking victims. It's going to come from CEOs of companies, from the big financial firms, the banks, the hedge funds. They are going to give the money. So this is again, from a very high altitude, the big problem. Now let me go a little bit more into the specifics where this plays a role. So one very obvious thing is protectionism. So when powerful companies in the richest countries, if they feel that their markets are threatened by foreign competition, they appeal to their government and say, oh, we don't want to have to deal with this competition. Could you please impose tariffs or even simply keep those other people out? We just had it days ago where the US government said we will put very large tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, and maybe we won't allow them at all into the country because they are going to compete too strongly with our own companies. Now, this is something that among very powerful countries, they will come to some sort of understanding. You let my things into your country, and I will let your things into my country. They can sort of arrange themselves, but it's the poor countries that will fall by the wayside, where they have to beg and plead to get their products onto the markets of the rich countries. The World Trade Organization was supposed to achieve that, But as we all know, it's become a patchwork of rules and restrictions and so on. And again, poor countries find it very difficult, small firms from poor countries, to compete in the rich markets where all the money is concentrated. Another big thing is tax justice. So there is now a big effort at the United Nations to achieve some more tax justice. But basically the situation as it is that the big multinational firms do not pay any taxes. Now, how do they achieve that? They achieve it by arranging their operations in such a way that all their profits accrue in countries that have no corporate taxes. These countries are called tax havens. The most egregious example within Europe is Ireland, a big tax haven, but there are many, many others around the world, Bermuda, the British Virgin Islands, and so on and so forth. So a multinational corporation has subsidiaries in many different countries, and these subsidiaries do all sorts of deals with each other. And in pricing these deals, they have a lot of freedom. They can overprice these deals or underprice these deals. And in that way, they can shift profits from one country to another. The profit stays with Exxon or Shell or Siemens or whatever the company may be, but it moves from Exxon US to Exxon British Virgin Islands. And there, of course, it is taxed at a zero rate. And so big multinationals they all have tremendous tax lawyers and accountants specializing in this. They manage to avoid paying taxes. That means that in the poor countries, let's say in Africa and in India and so on, they compete at an advantage against the local companies. Local companies do not have the luxury of paying no taxes. They have to pay taxes. So here's a local company, small and confined to a single nation, that faces a tremendous disadvantage in competing against a much larger multinational company because it has to pay taxes and the multinational doesn't. And this is how multinational corporations can displace and basically overwhelm and cut down the fledgling local companies, smaller companies in poorer countries. And that is how they can suck out tremendous amounts of financial wealth out of the poorer countries, with the result that investment capital in those countries is scarce. Another thing is resource extraction. Often poor countries, the one thing that they have is ample resources. They have oil, they have cadmium, all the things that are now needed for the new information technologies. And this would be a very good opportunity for them to get on their feet. It would give them starting capital with which they could then invest in infrastructure and education, which are the most important components of successful development. But again, that very often doesn't happen. It doesn't happen because rich multinational corporations come in, they bribe local politicians, and with relatively little money, they get themselves incredibly advantageous contracts where they can exploit resources for decades. They even get free electricity, and they are not bothered by local labor laws and so on. They lock in these contracts with politicians who are local politicians who are corrupt, paying them staggering amounts of money by local context, and thereby extracting from the country vastly larger amounts of money that the country has no benefit for. If you look at the development again of Africa, you will find that over the last 50 years or so, the average income in Africa has been stagnant. It has not gone up. That despite the fact that immense amount of resources were exported from Africa, and these resources simply did no good. The money, of course, these resources, somebody paid for them, but the money ended up not with the rank and file populations in Africa, but if any Africans got any benefit from them, it was dictators and their cronies, people like Abacha and Mobutu and so on and so forth. And that gets me to another topic, the topic of corruption, which of course is rampant in the poorer countries. And we in the richer countries like to say, oh, this is part of their culture. This is how they are. They just like strongmen. They like corrupt people. This is normal in their culture and history and tradition. But really what we overlook is that this corruption wouldn't exist if there weren't these enormous inequalities, if our corporations and our governments weren't deliberately and very actively corrupting people in the developing world, and often also killing or otherwise overthrowing people who refuse to be corrupt. That has happened plenty of times, that those people have been overthrown. Last point I could make is debt. So that's another way in which the rich countries of the global north maintain their dominance over the south, is by lending money and then forcing these poor countries to spend a very considerable portion of their national income, of their national budgets, on debt repayment, which of course is to the detriment of infrastructure, of education, of healthcare, all the things that are crucial for developing the country and catching up with a much richer north. So I think that there is a vicious cycle going on where an existing inequality that was really started, it's not very old, it started just a few centuries ago in the colonial period, where an initial inequality is now perpetuated through the fact, thanks to the fact that rich corporations and governments can use their economic advantages to politically shape the international system, economic system, in such a way that it works to their advantage and perpetuates this inequality.
There is another question by Olivia Smith, and actually Olivia Smith is a specialist of criminal law, and she says, thank you for the great presentations. There is a critical need to strengthen law enforcement and judicial systems as we intensify efforts to combat trafficking. The current prosecution rates remain low, and traffickers' increasing use of advanced technology exacerbates this challenge. To effectively disrupt these operations, we must focus on building institutional capacity and equipping law enforcement and judicial bodies with the necessary tools, training, and technology. Without these measures, our efforts to combat trafficking will remain incomplete, leaving significant gaps in the fight against this pervasive crime. But I think, Olivia, that's a very good question. I don't know who would like to comment, Thomas, or would you have a...
I certainly agree with that point. I would maybe just add one more thing, namely that very often this isn't even just crime. You know, that, as I said earlier, a lot of it is just a voluntary, or superficially speaking, voluntary transaction. Let me give you one example. When I traveled in the Philippines and arrived there at the airport, I saw a red carpet, and there was a special queue for people who were guest workers abroad. They had especially received, they had shorter waiting times and so on. And these are overwhelmingly women, and they're women who, because of the economic circumstances of their families, because they want to achieve a better life for their children, they go abroad for years and years on end, and live abroad under slavery-like conditions as domestic servants, where they are at the beck and call of their masters, basically, and live under horrendous conditions. Their passport is being taken away and so on. They more or less know what they're getting into. They know that they are subject to abuse, subject even to sexual abuse, that they are mistreated and so on. They do it because they say, this is a sacrifice that I'm willing to make for my children. And so should this be criminal? Maybe, but it should be criminal only if we could have a better opportunity for these women, if we could somehow give them hope that their children can have a better life without them having to sacrifice, without them having to deprive these very same children of their mother for years and years, leaving them in the care of grandparents typically. So it is these sorts of situations that we should also bear in mind, I think, when we think about human trafficking, that legal business that is shipping willing middle-aged Filipino women to remote locations for years on end so that they can send back some money for their families.
Now, also, there is a question for you, Thomas. How he is dealing with human trafficking different between developed and developing countries? According to you, is there any difference that you noticed? If so, what are they? That's from Sri Lakshmi Vairagahur.
Yeah, so I think there is a statistical difference. So the cases of trafficking are typically different cases. The way people get into, become trafficking victims, become slaves, the pathways are different. So I've worked quite a bit on trafficking here in the United States, and very often the victims of trafficking are young Black women who, in one way or another, fall victim to the criminal justice system. They get arrested for shoplifting, or they become drug addicted, and in one way or another, they run afoul of the law. They are thrown out of their ordinary education system. They then mix up or get mixed up with the wrong sort of people, criminal gangs, pimps, drug dealers, and so forth, and who try to make them drug dependent. So there is more of an active component. Of course, there is a pre-existing vulnerability that is due to the fact that people are in unsafe neighborhoods and need to somehow negotiate their own protection. And there's often also a vulnerability that comes from being undocumented aliens. So we have millions of people who are, or at least used to be, highly tolerated in the US because we needed them for menial jobs, but we didn't want to give them minimum wages and protect them in any way. So that underclass of people who officially didn't exist, but were really here and were really doing work, that, of course, is an underclass of people who are very highly vulnerable because people interacting with them always have the threat. If you don't do what I say, then I will denounce you to the authorities and you will get deported. That is not always true, but it is certainly a threat that is credible and that scares many people into compliance. Now, I think from what I know about the situation in many of the poorer countries, such as Africa and South Asia, the way in which people fall into the trap of modern day slavery is somewhat different. It's often poverty. It's poverty of the family. The family has to take out a loan, and they put up their children for collateral, for example. They say that if I don't pay back this, for Western standards, ridiculously small amount of money within a certain period, then you can have my son to work in your, as a domestic or in your brick factory or whatever it may be. weaving and so forth. And so again, it's economic necessity and pressure, but of a different sort. And of course, the needs in developing countries are extreme very often, right? People, as I showed you, by the billions cannot feed their own families. And so they are desperately looking for ways to make sure that at least some of their children survive, right? Can you imagine what it feels like as a parent to sell your own daughter into prostitution? This is something that you do only if you are driven into extreme need. You feel, my younger children cannot survive unless I find some way of feeding them. And the only way I can do that is by asking my 15-year-old daughter to make this ultimate sacrifice for her siblings. And so again, that is a different pathway that leads to the same sort of horrendous life for, in this case, young people.